Welcome to the 7th Presence XR webinar. We are delighted to have you with us. Shortly, the webinar coordinator, Professor Mel Slater, distinguished investigator at the University of Barcelona and director of the EVEN Lab, the Experimental Virtual Environment Lab for Neuroscience and Technologies, will introduce our guest speakers today, Ana Zappa and Antoni Rodriguez-Fornells. Be please aware that we are recording this session for our project website. You are welcome to submit questions through the Q&A box at any time during the presentation that we will read it at the end, or alternatively, you may raise your hand at the end of the session to ask your questions directly. Mel, the stage is yours then.
Thanks very much. So I'd like to introduce Ana Zappa and Antoni Rodriguez-Fornells. Ana Zappa is a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Barcelona. Her research examines how social interactions shape cognitive processes such as language learning, combining neurophysiological measures with immersive virtual reality to ensure ecological validity. Within the Presence project, she's been investigating how virtual environments modulate social interaction and co-presence. And Antoni Rodriguez-Fornells is an ICREA researcher. He's a cognitive neuroscientist and coordinator of the Cognition and Brain Plasticity Unit at EDBEL, part of the University of Barcelona. He's also in the Presence project, of course. He's mostly interested since his initial research on understanding human monitoring of actions and thoughts, including self-awareness of errors and error correction, and he specializes on EEG and brain imaging. We worked together with Mar Gonzalez Franco on some interesting studies a few years ago on agency and error monitoring using EEG measures. So over to you, Ana and Antoni, to share your slides and begin your talk. The talk will be about 45-50 minutes, and then there'll be time for the questions.
Thank you, Mel, for these presentations. I'm going to share the presentation. Okay, so thanks for Mel and E2CAT for the invitation to present, and also an opportunity to be presenting in the framework of the Presence project that we have been sharing at the horizon level. So I'm trying to begin a bit the presentation going back to one of the first talks from Mel at the beginning of the webinar, where he was trying to present what is this feeling of presence, the feeling of being there, interacting in a particular environment, and to which extent it will depend on several phenomena or illusions that could be described during when the person is actually embedded in virtual reality or immersed. So one is the place of illusion, to which extent people are thinking they are in the space that are in the VR space, and even that they know they are not there, to which extent this is an illusion that is happening. And it depends, of course, in the sensory-motor contexts, the physical setup that allow them to have the feeling of being in another place. I am there. Then the plausibility effect, which is very important, and we're going to be seeing that later also, to which extent people are really thinking that what is happening at the VR is really happening. So to which extent this is a response environment where you see, you have predictions about your own behavior, and then you see how people are interacting to you, or the environment is responding to your incoherence, and in a way you might be expecting depending on your expectations and your own predictions. Another very important illusion is body ownership, which is actually enhanced with first spectrum perspective, and trying to see to which extent the body in which you are projected on the avatar or in another type of surrogate body, you're really thinking that this is your body, and you feel like that you have this body. And then also this is the other concept, which is basically the idea of the project as measuring co-presence. So to which extent you have the feeling that you are there, but with or interacting with other people. So I'm going to be dealing mostly with some studies that we have been doing on neuroimaging and other people, and trying to understand to which extent neuroimaging and EEG could be allowing us to disentangle these different factors affecting the presence. And I think Anna will be later talking more about using EEG to measure co-presence. Okay. So I think for a cognitive science perspective, the fact that we could actually have another body and perceive another body and interact in another environment asks many questions, and it's basically very intriguing, no? And one of the important things is that it's really pointing to one of the important questions in cognitive science is how do we monitor our environment? How do we monitor our actions in a particular environment? And how we are basically detecting that we are performing as we expect, for example, depending on our prediction. So in a real world environment, so we really know that we normally produce actions, we have the feeling of agency, the feeling that we are doing things that are associated to what we want to do. And we know that because we perform in actions and they change the environment. And basically these expectations about the changing of the environment give us this feeling of agency. So I'm responsible of my actions, okay? But the possibility to create illusions, I think I'm depicting here, for example, the rubber hand illusions, where you can have the feeling of that the fake hand actually could become part of your body, or you have the illusion of body ownership and you have a proprioceptive effect there, no? Or the fact that you could live, or you can be thinking that environment that is not there, in which you are in VR, it could be yours, create a strange component, which is actually it's not the feeling that you are in a particular space, your physical body is in another space, but you're actually experiencing an environment and a body that is not your own. So it's actually so it makes you asks you a lot of questions about how our brain is creating this capacity to be so flexible that you can experience another body in another environment and interacting with another setup. So this is actually a very interesting idea. So how to measure presence? It has been tried several ways, but normally people say that you could use questionnaires, which normally I use it self-reported questionnaires after the experiencing, or at certain points during the experience, you are really going to be asked about, how do you feel situation, how do you feel your body, etc. How do you feel presence, etc. But the questionnaires have a lot of flaws because they are normally at the end. It's reconstructive, so it's not immediate, and it's also increasing the load on the participants about the tasks that they have to do. You can also use behavioral measures like eye tracking, for example. But alternatively, it could be very interesting to use on a type of psychophysiological measures that are associated to your autonomic response system or your central nervous systems, like, for example, skin conductance, heart rate, pupillometry, electroencephalography, and other EEG measures. So we're going to be focusing especially on EEG, which is basically the recording of the brain activity using electroencephalography. We normally use multiple electrodes to have a better representation of the space topography, or what we call the potential sources where the EEG is happening. And basically, that's what people are using normally, EEG caps of 64, 32 channels. And one of the advantages of these measures is that, in a way, they could provide information about presence online. And because this is a continuous measure, so you constantly embed it in an environment, so it's evolving in time. This could be actually providing implicit or more tacit information about several aspects of the presence and the illusions embedded in presence. An important aspect is, for example, what it has been described like the breaks of presence. What happens when people are suddenly they are participating in one of the VR experiment, but suddenly the experience of presence breaks and they are back, or they really experience back the physical reality. So they really, these moments in which the breaks of in which presence is breaks could be very interesting, for example, to try to see what happens in the EEG or in the other domains, for example. No? So these breaks of presence are interesting because in a way you're interacting in another world, so you have expectations about your motor behavioral and the consequences that you have to in the virtual environment, in a way. So normally, if we have the sensor, if we move, for example, and we have the feedback that we expect, then we maintain the presence, the presence feeling. But for example, when we do something and then it's not reflected in the virtual environment, then somehow you have an unexpected feedback, and then maybe you have what is called a prediction error. So you expected a particular consequence of your action, it's not happening, and then these are the moments that could be affecting your presence, and or presence collapse in a way. You enter in these breaks in presence, and you reorient your attention probably to your physical body in a way. So you are experience something, but suddenly you realize yourself that you are not more in the virtual environment, but basically you are really back into your experience in the room with the head-mounted display, and somehow this is what we call breaking in presence. Okay, so related to how do we can monitor our actions, so there has been a lot of research in the last decades, basically trying to understand what we do when we monitor errors in a way. So if I'm in a VR experience, for example, and I'm interacting with a VR in a VR setting, for example, we still are monitoring our errors in a way. So, and in a way, that's one of the advantages that we use, is that we have a lot of information about what brain signals are associated to error monitoring. This is one of the first studies that described for first time what people, the brain signatures associated to when people detect their own errors. For example, imagine that you are a participant in a laboratory doing a very simple reaction time task. You have to press to the right for when there is a right arrow, or left, or whatever, very simple task. Sometimes you make mistakes. And what happens here is this is the brain reaction of the people commit immediately the wrong response. What you see here is that on the incorrect response, you see a negativity actually increasing compared to when people are committing correct responses. And what is very important here that I want to highlight is that this response is very fast. It's nearly 60, 80 milliseconds immediately after the error commission. So it's something like the brain is detecting the error signal, is producing an error signal or conflict signal or whatever, or that something is going wrong, and it's going very fast. At the beginning, people were thinking this could be the subjective feeling of being wrong, that you realize that you are wrong, because normally these errors are errors that you are very aware of these errors, but it's too fast to be a conscious representation of an error. So that's something that you could think as a very powerful internal error signal that is triggered immediately after something is going wrong. So normally the localization of this signal has been associated to the anterior cingulate, SM8, other regions in the mid-central prefrontal cortex, and is also associated to many other functions. So anterior cingulate is associated also to situations of conflict between two responses, or two thoughts, two decisions, uncertainty under responding, response errors, or also negative feedback when we receive feedback that is wrong, for example, about our actions, or etc. So in general, these are signals that you have, and basically are indicating that something is going wrong. You can say an error, a conflict, etc. Okay. So again, this is a very good example when people are putting a lot of attention to the errors. So when you ask people to be very accurate about their own responses, compared to be a lot more faster than accurate, for example, you can see that the amplitude of this component is activated, or is larger in the accuracy compared to the speed condition. So in a sense, it means that this component is also associated to the amount of awareness or monitoring or effort you're putting to be much more accurate or not. So you can use that in several ways. So let me explain you an experiment about why is this component so fast? I mean, and the experiment I want to show is a classical experiment from Banshee, in which it was one of the first EEG interactive studies. So the study was very similar to the reaction time, short reaction time, and here in the experiment they were recording the EEG on both the person that was doing the experiment. It was a very simple reaction time task. They have to press to the central arrow to the left in this case, and the other ones are distractors. And then here is the observer, which also had an EEG recording, and the observer is only showing or look into the behavior of the actor or the executor. In a way, he's not performing the action, but basically monitoring the errors of the other. So the question here was, do we use the same mechanism to monitor our own errors and to monitor the errors of the other people in a way? No? So that's why they were basically creating this situation. What you see here is the errors of the person that is performing the action. So here you see a classical, what we call error-related negativity, as we saw before. Very fast, around 80 milliseconds, you see that, this person, the executor, realized that he had committed a very stupid mistake or very wrong mistake or something very fast. But now what happens with the observer? The observer actually has something very similar, and you see that the topography, the representation of the signal in the brain is very similar, central, anterior, and again, you see that same representation. But I think the important thing here is to show is that this signal is very slow in a way. So it's present around 250 to 300 milliseconds. Okay, and that's what we call the observational error-related negativity. So in a way, it has less amplitude. It might be less strong, for example, but it has similarities between that. But what is important here for me, and that's what I really think that is very important for the VR experience we're going to be presenting later, is that this guy has the executor has a very fast signal, because this is the predictive signal. It's something that we can develop in our brain very fast because we have internal mechanisms that allow us to predict that something is going to be wrong. While the observer is only dependent on the visual environment. So he can only know that this guy did something wrong, look into what's happening in the environment. So it's visual dependent, and that's why there's no prediction he has no prediction that something is going wrong. So I think this is the best example to understand that the theory component is something that comes from a internal mechanism, what we call internal error monitoring system, and that allows us, our brain allows us to have predictions about what is going to happen on the consequence of our behaviors, and then we create these forward models that allow us to have mechanisms or error signals before the commission of the error. So it's something that allows you to correct your own speech, to correct your performance, even before you actually doing that. But then if we think on the observer has a very slow ERE component because basically depends on the environment, depends on seeing the environment. So we know that our actions have to have some consequence on the environment. So we need to see what's the actual state of the environment. Then we receive the sensory feedback, proprioceptive, visual, auditory, perceptive, etc. And then if there is a match between what we wanted and our prediction and the things that we expected and how they change the environment, then we create this sense of agency, okay? This is what we call the external error monitoring signal. So the internal one is the one that is very fast, allows you to make predictions and correct your behavior, and the external one depends on how the environment is performing in a way. No? So if you think on the VR situation, we always depend on a visual environment because we're not controlling the environment per se, in a way. So it's not our own body; it's a body that is reacting on another space in a way. No, and also it's very interesting to think about this sense of agency, the feeling of being responsible for action. Because if you think about that, we don't normally have this. We don't normally think about the sense of agency. We always think that this is a default condition. It's very thin phenomenologic in the sense that it's very weak, and we practically never have feelings of non-agency. So, but it can happen in the VR. For example, it can happen because you can be performing in seeing yourself projected in an avatar, for example, and then suddenly the avatar might not be behaving as you expected. You are moving the right hand, the avatar is moving the left hand. I'm looking to some avatar, and then the avatar is not, another avatar is not looking to me. So there might be these agency problems or situations where you enter into these breaks in presence, so that might be affected. So I think sense of agency is a very important concept here to understand. So one of the first experiments we realized with the help of Gonzalo and Padrao, González Franco, and Mel, and Mavis and Vives, it was related to this idea. So what happens when the person actually detects errors in the virtual environment? So that's one also very interesting situation to see that we could compare how do we process our own errors, and comparing that to a situation where you are doing correct actions in your physical body, but they are really represented erroneously in another body. No? You could also think about that in another way, thinking on the idea of telepresence, that you are, for example, conducting a robot in another place, and then you have the feeling that you are experiencing you're embodied into the situation, but suddenly the robot behaves as you are not expecting, because you are not doing that particular movement, and the robot is actually moving in other ways. So these are violations of agency actually that could be very interesting to be used. No? So we use it a situation where we had EEG recordings on top of the head-mounted display, and also we had a hand tracking device. And then the task was very simple. We had what we call a flanker task, and people have to respond only to the central arrow, and they basically respond to the left or respond to the fast. It's a very dynamic and very fast task. And then suddenly what we did is having a huge amount of trials where the avatar was always responding exactly as the participant. And suddenly in a second phase, we began to introduce 50% of the times some strange errors. So the avatar was behaving in the other way around. So if I was responding with the right hand, suddenly the avatar was responding with the left hand, for example. So you can see here a very nice video. So it was first person perspective and full embodiment. So you can see that the environment is optimal. So they had a strong feeling of ownership, and also of synchrony was very good between the hand. Now you will be seeing the task in the upper part, and also how the avatar is behaving. And normally in most of the trials, the same hand is the one that they are doing. So they are very synchronous, and suddenly an error will come in red. Now, for example, it came on one where you see, for example, that I can repeat that. This is synchronous, and now they will become an asynchronous one. So that's the task we were doing. Basically, we were generating this type of external errors or fake errors because the person was not doing that. So at the self-reported measures were showing that people were actually having strong feelings of ownership. For example, I felt as if the virtual body was my body, and normally that was very huge. But also it was important to realize that they were aware of the errors that were introduced. For example, in the 7, for example, the question was sometimes the virtual hand seemed to be moving by itself, and in the synchronous ones, when there is no fake errors, there's nothing. And then in the asynchronous, they realized that there was some introduction of fake errors in the situation. Okay, so the important thing was how was the earpiece. And what you see in the earpiece, it was quite surprising at the beginning, but very interesting. So in blue, you can see the real errors, what happens when people are doing real errors and compared to the correct responses. And what you see here is classical, what we call error-related negativity, a very fast component. But for the virtual errors, when there is an introduction of an error of the avatar that was not produced by me, what you see is again a delayed component, but much more parietal, and a strong negative component. Okay, so this was surprising, and the component was very similar to a component that is normally associated to semantic violation, which is called the N400 component. And you can see it here, for example, a classical example of the N400 component. I was going to eat a pizza, or I was going to eat a house or a cow. So the N400 is a measure of semantic incongruence in a way. No? So we somehow interpreted that this could be associated to the idea that, that people are experiencing an incongruence between the body actions and the actions that the avatar is producing. And then another interesting thing is that we wanted to rule out that also that this this could be associated to the observation of the error. So we created another condition where there was not agency in a way, so the participant was again inside the VR environment, but was only looking passively to the behavior of the previous session. So he was looking to the correct and erroneous responses of the avatar, but he was not performing the action. So it was again like the observation case in the other study, no? And again, what you see is in red. So you see a very clear observation component. So they realize about the errors that were committed. But again, there is not N400 component. So the whatever is the N400 or the violation of body semantics or the error signal that appears there associated to the breaking presence, if you want, that was not present in the observational case. Okay, so we end up thinking that the error-related component we know is associated to this internal monitoring of signal, where we have prediction about what will happen, and we can actually detect these signals very fast. But then that the N400 was somehow monitoring also these external loops. So when you have to monitor also that the consequence of your behavior are the ones that you expected in a way, and that the incongruence actually could be affected. Interestingly, I read a nice paper from Marc Gonzalez with Lanier actually thinking about this idea that a useful definition of VR, which distinguishes VR from other complex media technologies, is that VR tends to avoid semantic violations as the brain and body interact in synchrony with the simulated environment. Okay, so they're trying to rely on this idea that of semantic violation, that there has to be a semantic congruence between the behavioral and how the brain is integrating these signals actually to create these feelings of presence or immersion. Okay, so that's one of the experiments. And another thing that was interesting is that the topography of this component was associated to the parietal site, and we know that from several fMRI studies that inferior parietal cortex is actually associated to this comparison model when people have to monitor the congruency of their actions. For example, it has also been associated to schizophrenia and some delusional states. So it's a very interesting comparison between these parietal regions and the N400 distribution. Okay. After that, I also realized that some studies previously from ERPs have been actually finding that, and they have been showing these effects also when they were programming tasks, and suddenly there's a block, the response buttons, for example, stop going on. For example, you can see here the error-related, the internal errors, and then when suddenly the buttons stop working, so you see this kind of, again, N400 component, and also another case here when, for example, there was a malfunction condition when, for example, suddenly the feedback was not appearing, you also see this, again, this parietal N400 component. So there's kind of a similarity across these different conditions. We want with a PhD student we had, Alba Gomez Andres, we tried also to do more research on these agency prediction errors. So to which extent we could try to see what type of difference were between different agency prediction errors when you expect something in the environment and suddenly it doesn't happen, in terms of that you change the site of the fan, or you can also delay the outcome, for example, and see what happens in the agency. Okay. So in this case, we did a similar kind of a study, but not in VR. This is a study where the subject is responding to the same task, to the flanker task, but then the hands are below the monitor, so the subject doesn't see their own hands, but within the monitor, they are projected both hands. It has also a glove, so it has a lot of similarities. So thinking on the Aruba hand illusion, you see that there will be a lot of body ownership in this case. What we do is, again, similarly, we introduce some errors. Suddenly, in the task, for example, when I'm responding with the right hand, the image will be shown that you are responding with the left hand, for example. And then in the other experiment, we introduced it a delay, for example. So the response came like delayed. For example, I'm responding and then I see my hand responding but delayed in time. Okay. Again, what you see is that body ownership was the feeling of body ownership or the illusion of body ownership is very high in both conditions. So there's a lot of it's very high the the attribution of body ownership. And again, they realized about the errors. So, for example, sometimes the digital hands seem to be moving by themselves, or sometimes the error. So they basically are pretty aware of the errors that they are detecting. Okay, here you can see the results for the real errors. For example, this is a real error, self-error, compared to the real correct responses. So you see a classical ERN. But what we see in this case, remember that here it is not in a VR, so we are in a normal lab. Basically, people are showing observing different types of images. So what you see here is that when there is an external error that happens, now you don't see the N4, but you see a strong P6 component. This P6 component is probably associated to the P300, which is a classical component associated to surprise, context updating, learning, and also, attention reorientation. Okay, so now you see that this is a different component. And again, when we presented the outcome but delayed, for example, when you see that your hand but is delayed 400 milliseconds, you see the same N2 P600, but now delayed 400 milliseconds, and again with the same topography. Okay, so again, these were different findings from the ones we show it on the VR. We don't see the N4, but we saw a P600 component associated to agency attributions and violations of the predicted mental states. And basically, that's another thing. I can skip this one, for example. I'm going to a quite interesting study I recently read from Breaks in Present. This is a study that was published this year already, and they tried to study, in particular, these breaks in present. So when people are in the VR, for example, and then suddenly something occurs, and then you are back into a reality, if you want, or you have this feeling that the presence is broken. Okay, so they use an interesting design, which is a slingshot game, and then they had two conditions. One is embodied and one is non-embodied. In the embodied condition, the person actually grasps, can grasp actually the slingshot and make the movement, and then they see the feedback when the ball arrives to the back to the end of the trajectory. And then in a non-embodied condition, they play the game, but they play it with a joystick. So in a way, it's not passive because they are controlling that, but it's not really embodied using the hands or etc. Okay, and then they have these conditions. Say they use 80. It's a 2x2 design, so they have 80 trials and 20 trials of breaking presence, in a way, or interruption. And then this is the timing design where they release the sling and then they see the outcome. Okay, this is the video where maybe it's easier to see. It's first person perspective. You can see the hands, and now this is the embodied condition, so they can grasp and they release the link, and then basically they see the feedback. They can have different graspings. Okay, and now they will become in the breaking presence or the violation, if you want. This is freezing, when suddenly the hand will be freeze, and also the sling. You will see now the hand is freeze, and then you don't see the ball, and then you see now you will see the non-embodied condition, where people will be resting with their hands in the chair and manipulating the joystick. The joystick can make different types of movements, so you can actually make the game. You can use that very easily, down, left, right with the joystick, and release with the trigger of the joystick. So it's, again, this is not passive condition like the one we used it before, but it's a non-embodied, and they also use breaks of present using the same type. So okay, so these are the conditions, and the results show it very interesting pattern. So here you can see that this is the moment where the ball is released, in this moment at 0, okay? And what you see here is the embodied conditions which are normal are the solid lines. So both normal conditions show a kind of P4, P3 effect, or whatever. But what you see is that the breaks in present, both dashed lines, show a very clear negative component and N400 condition. So if you subtract that, you will see this for the embodied and for the non-embodied conditions, the same N4 component appears with same topography and very similar indeed to the experiment we did with Mel, Mar, and Gonzalo before. So again, I was quite surprised to see that it's very interesting because again, we tend to see this, or we see very clearly this N400 component. The topography is centroparietal, and it also has been replicated in 2 resonance studies, also one from Pursuit on expectant hand movements in virtual track body, and another one in lesser using visotactile mismatches. So again, we see quite very good replication about this kind of violations of coherence, maybe in the virtual environment, compared to what you expect. So as an interim conclusion, and before giving my stage to Anna, so going back to the idea of how to measure presence, so I only talk here about ERP components, but there are many other options that we could use, especially we can use, for example, time frequency and oscillatory components. We can also use other types of measures related to coherence and other types of potential analysis of EEG. So, but I think that what we're showing actually is that there is quite a lot of interesting ERP components that could be used as signatures of presence or breaks in presence, if you will, like for this kind of semantic violations or incongruent violation between the real world and the virtual environment using N400, and then the N2P600 component. We don't know to which extent the difference between the experiments we did in virtual environment and the ones that we didn't do it in virtual environment, although they had body ownership in both conditions, they didn't have the same results. So that's something like we need to think about what affects these components, if it's about embodiment. It was interesting because the authors actually of the previous study suggested that the non-embodied condition also had the N400, so it was strange because the person was not completely embodied and was not doing the slingshot. But again, to my point of view, they were doing it was an active condition because they were manipulating the slingshot with a game stick, with the joystick. So it's not completely passive as the one we were seeing, for example, only observing errors. So yeah, basically, I think there are a lot of research that could be done in this direction, and I'm giving my turn now to Anna. Thank you a lot for the participation.
Okay, hi everyone. I will continue. Okay, so I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about simultaneous brain measures across groups to examine social interaction, so both in real life and how this can be extended to extended reality or virtual reality. One of the things that we are doing in the Presence Project is developing neuroscience-based tools to better understand social interaction in virtual reality. So this is what this part of the presentation is about. Okay, so traditionally, social neuroscience is focused on individuals observing social stimuli, so faces, videos, recorded speech. But of course, we know that real social interaction is, well, interactive. It's dynamic, and we respond to each other in real time. Second-person neuroscience focuses on neuroprocesses while people are actively interacting with one another. And one methodology that allows us to do exactly this is called hyperscanning. So quite simply, hyperscanning is instead of just measuring brain activity in one brain, it's measuring brain activity in 2 or more brains, and most commonly simultaneously. So this terminology comes from the fMRI literature originally, but now it's also widely used for FMIRS and electroencephalography, so EEG. And we've chosen to use EEG in our work in this project. The main reason probably is that it has very high temporal precision, which is very useful when looking at social interactions because it means that we're not just looking at brain synchrony across an entire period, but we can also look at it in specific periods of the social interaction. Okay, so yes, the overall idea is that measuring two interacting brains is particularly powerful for studying the neurobiology of social interaction. So our objectives are to evaluate co-presence using modern EEG hyperscanning techniques. Specifically, we're going to use intersubject correlation, ISC, which captures basically the similarity between neural signals across individuals and over time. ISC can be used to measure synchrony over two independent brains. It can be used to measure synchrony that's externally driven. So often we call this low-level synchrony. So if all of us were to be watching the same video, for instance, our brains would very likely synchronize. Also, we can observe leader-follower synchrony during social interaction, sequential interaction, and then dynamic interaction between pairs, and then finally, of course, group interaction. And so in this project, we're focusing on group interaction. Okay, so EEG-ISC can be used across small groups to evaluate engagement and participants' feelings of plausibility during a task. It can also reflect the amount of enjoyment that they're experiencing. And overall, this approach provides a very promising new avenue to investigate the neuroscience of group interaction in VR settings. Okay, the idea is very simple in a way, is that when people are sharing attention, engagement, or experience, their brain activity becomes more aligned. So how do we actually measure ISC? Well, to compute ISC, we record EEG from multiple participants simultaneously, and then we just compute correlations across brains within sliding time windows. So here, these are 5-second windows, but this can vary, and windows that overlap. So this allows us to track alignment dynamically over the course of interaction. Okay, interestingly, synchrony does not require face-to-face interaction. So for example, in this study, dyads were played a cooperative online game, and they were actually in separate rooms, so they didn't see each other or hear each other. And they still found interbrain phase synchrony between these participants just from cooperating on the same task. So here we see basically in the blue the real dyads, so the real pairs that actually work together, and they were compared to false pairs. So false pairs were basically they would randomly take one participant from one pair and one from another pair, and what they're trying to see or prove is that the synchrony they're finding is not just coming from being involved in a similar task or the same task, but actually working together. So what they found was that across all the frequency bands they were looking at, and I won't go into the frequency bands in detail for matters of time, but they looked at the alpha, the beta, and the gamma frequency bands. So this was true of all of these bands and also over all the regions that they were looking at. So voila. There have also been studies that have directly compared real world and VR collaborations between participants. So this first study compared joint visual search in VR compared to real world. And you can see in these two, I don't know if you can, okay, so this is on the A, on the left-hand side is the real world, of course, condition, and the B is the VR condition. And what they found was reliable interbrain synchrony in VR that was very much comparable to the real world interaction. And you can see that in these two graphs here on the right. So basically what you're seeing is where they found synchrony between two channels across two participants, and they found a very similar synchrony across real world and VR. But this isn't always the case. Another study found different results. So they had design students who were studying design, perform a designing task together in VR, so a creative, collaborative task, and they compared it to a real life condition. Now, the final results, the final outcomes of their design were the quality was similar, so they did a good job in both contexts. But VR showed reduced synchrony compared to real world settings. So this suggests that communication quality, embodiment, and cognitive alignment are important for synchrony. So overall, VR seems to be possible to support synchrony, but the quality of the synchrony depends on the design of the environment and probably of the task itself. Okay. So, okay, this brings us to interactive neurosynchrony, so the alignment of brain activity across people in real time, so social interaction. Which reflects shared attention and coordination between partners. So what studies have shown basically is that speakers and listeners' brain activity becomes aligned during communication. They've shown stronger synchrony is linked to better communication and understanding, which is very important. And also the opposite is true, of course. So synchrony is reduced when communication breaks down. So, of course, hyperscanning is particularly valuable for studying social cognition in realistic settings, including virtual environments. Okay, and now finally, our study. So social co-presence or being with others enables social interaction. Seems pretty obvious, but so this idea of measuring co-presence is very important for VR. We want to make sure that people actually feel present with others, right? So traditionally, this is measured, like Antoni was saying, via questionnaires or physiological responses also, like heart rate variability and skin conductance. But these are, of course, indirect and not interaction specific. And in the current study, we chose to use interactive neurosynchrony as a metric of social co-presence across small groups during collaborative game playing in VR, which I'll explain in a second. So this is what we came up with. So we basically, our task was to come up with an experiment where we could measure social interaction without people actually talking, because we were measuring EEG. When you talk, that creates too much noise, and we can't read the signal from the brain accurately enough. So this game called The Mind, we developed a VR version of it, and it's a quite simple game, very cool game actually, where you each get a card. Everybody gets a card with a certain number on it, and only the players can see their own cards. And then you have to place the cards in order, so in ascending order, in the middle. So in this case, yeah, you have the display in the middle and only the participants can see their cards. And at first you get one card, and if you succeed in that round, you then everybody gets 2 cards and 3 cards and so on and so forth. And the more successful you are, the higher you get in the levels, right? So the idea is that participants collaborate via telepathy to place the cards in order on the table in ascending order. And we had participants, or we will have, we've performed a few pilots, but yeah, the idea is to have participants in 3 separate rooms, of course, with measuring EEG, and they would be wearing HMD headsets. One great advantage of VR is that we can actually manipulate the environment that each specific participant is in. So a huge criticism in the hyperscanning literature, especially the literature that tries to relate interbrain synchrony or interbrain coherence to social interaction, is that actually, like I was saying before, the synchrony can also come from low-level stimuli. So if you're seeing the same thing or hearing the same thing, your brain is likely to synchronize with brains that are seeing the same thing. So in this case, what we did is we have 3 different environments, and so participants actually are not seeing the same thing. So we can subtract this, we can kind of get rid of this low-level synchrony, and more easily link whatever synchrony we do find to social processes. Okay, so we have groups of 3 participants. They're performing 2 tasks. One is just a resting state where they do nothing for 5 minutes. And the second one, which is a baseline, which you generally have in hyperscanning studies. And the second is the main task, which is where they're playing this game, The Mind, for 30 minutes in the visually different rooms. In terms of analyses, we're looking at the EEG signal, ISC across the full experiment, compared to resting state. We're also going to be looking at ERPs like what Antoni showed you previously. I'll go into those in a second. We're going to be looking at success in the game, of course, so how well the groups got into higher levels. So again, I want to emphasize this is a collaborative game, so they're not playing against each other. So if they win, they win together. If they lose together. So success means collaborative success, okay? It's important to understand the task. Then self-evaluation, so questionnaires, and then we have participants, write 250 words about their experience and perform sentiment analyses of this task, and also use it to, get for qualitative reasons. Okay, so this is just a short video of what it looked like. You'll see that, okay, so basically the colors in the central display are changing. I'll explain that in a second. The participants know what each color means. So green means you did a good job, you can move on. Yellow means you're going to answer, and yellow means wait to see if you got green or red, and blue means you can play. But I'll go into that in a second. And then in real life, what's happening is we have our 3 participants in their 3 separate environments, measuring EEG, wearing headsets. So you can imagine this is quite difficult to set up. To get everything working and synchronized, all ready for the experiment. And then if we walk down the hallway a little bit, we will find our 3rd participant in a 3rd separate room. And there she is. Okay. Okay. So as I said before, besides measuring the intersubject correlation or the synchrony between brains over the whole experiment, we're also looking at particular specific ERPs. These ERPs they're going to be showing us things what's happening basically in terms of how the participants monitor their own and others' performance on they're time locked to very specific moments in the experiment. So the first ERP we're looking at is this one. It's the SPN, the stimulus preceding negativity. And it's basically a marker of feedback expectations. So for instance, in this figure over here, the more negative is plotted up, so the more amplitude, the more negative the signal is, the more expectation the participant has of the feedback that he or she is about to receive, right? And then during feedback, we'll be looking at the ERN, so the error-related activity that Antoni presented to you previously, and also, which is usually for monitoring our own errors, and also the feedback-related negativity, the FRN, which monitors all errors and is greater for negative compared to positive feedback in general. So this is what a trial looks like during game playing. So you saw that in the monitor in the middle of the participants, there were color changes at the very top. So in this, that's why I put the video. So you can see here, the colors are changing. This is on fast forward, so they're going quite quickly. Or maybe it's on. No, this is real time. Sorry. Okay. So when they see the blue color, it means that anybody can play a card, right? Before the result, they have a yellow color, and that's when we'll be looking at the SPN, so the expectation of feedback. And we'll be comparing whether, this is similar between the person who actually played the card and the people who didn't play the card. Then during the feedback, they see fail or success, depending on whether they see a red or green color. And here we'll be looking at the ERN and the FRN for how they're monitoring their own behavior. And yes, and of course we'll be measuring the ISC throughout the whole thing. So in terms of hypotheses, again, we think participants will experience social co-presence while playing. The prediction is that in that case, if that were the case, we would find more brain-to-brain alignment during game versus during game playing, right? Versus resting state. We also think that as the game proceeds, social co-presence and cooperation will increase. And if this is the case, we would find increased brain-to-brain alignment as the game proceeds, and also increased similarity in the ERPs, SPN, ERN, FRN. Now, remember when they're playing, the fact that basically what I think would be interesting to really look at is when we were talking about errors earlier. In this case, if you play and it's incorrect, yes, that's an error. But also the people who have not played it's also their error because, whoever had the card that actually was the next card has also, in a sense, performed an error. So it would be interesting to see, how this performance is monitored during the game. And finally, we expect to find greater presence and engagement would lead to better performance, right? Because people are more present and are more linked into each other and interacting better and collaborating better and getting better at reading each other and playing this game better. And if this is the case, then we would expect to find a positive correlation between performance and interbrain synchrony. So for now, we have just run a couple of pilots. We're going to be starting to run the actual experiment in 2 weeks' time. So stay tuned for the results. So thanks very much, and questions are welcome. Maybe I'll stop sharing.
Thanks very much, Anna and Antoni, for very interesting talks and how this kind of work contributes to the Presence Project. I see that Ivan Volpe has his hand up. Would you like to ask your first question? You need to unmute yourself first. Okay, so let's move on. Ivan, if you sort out your speaking, then maybe you can come back. Are there any other questions? So, Anna, in terms of the results that you expect, what kind of contribution would you say that this will add to understanding of how, let's say, co-presence works?
I would, okay, ideally what we would have is actually have this experiment in real life as well and really compare what's happening in terms of hyperscanning interbrain correlation in the two situations. But I still think that in any case, if we find that interbrain synchrony is growing over time and that these ERPs are becoming more similar over time, it means that people are feeling each other's presence and they're actually collaborating with each other within this virtual environment, right? And I think it would be validating the environment, well, basically virtual reality for social interaction.
Okay, thanks. And Antoni, with respect to breaks in presence, do you think then the EEG is going to be the kind of objective way and the way that gets to underlying I mean, most people who study presence, we don't study underlying mechanisms because we can't. But maybe do you think that this looking at the N400 is the way to get to underlying mechanisms?
Yeah, I don't know what I've been evolving on that. So at the beginning, when we began this research, I never thought about breaks in presence, but I realized that this is a very interesting concept. And of course, you can do that because with EEG, you will see a reaction of your brain as soon as if you change from the VR setting to your physical reality, then it has to be a change, no? And I realized
Yeah.
that this is quite interesting, but you could also use other psychophysiological measures to back up that, no? But yeah, I think that opens a lot of possibilities, I think.
Yeah, and it kind of makes sense that a breakdown in the word just went from my mind. The breakdown in N400 measures. Say the word again.
Semantic.
The semantic discrepancy. That it makes complete sense that this would be involved in a break in presence. Because I mean, in a sense, that's what it is. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember I was reading one of your papers these days, and we were talking about it's very important the credibility of the context. So to what extent the context is credible for the story it's playing, no? In a way, and that
Yeah.
this presence basically, reduces currents, and it's difficult for you to come back to the plausibility in a way, no? But anyway.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. So we're out of time now. Thanks again to the two speakers and for Maria for organization. And same time next week, we continue with the 8th presentation in this series. So I look forward to seeing everyone again next week. And for now, we can close it. Thanks very much.
Thank you.